Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and addressing an audience like this. So I'm going to talk about Dogen's use of koans. You know, for a long time, William Bodiford was talking about the modern Soto view of Dogen, and he didn't mention this, but one characteristic of that is that the view that Dogen did not use koans, and that koans were something used in Rinzai Zen, and that this was a way to distinguish Soto Zen from Rinzai Zen. Well, when you begin reading the works of Dogen, you realize immediately how wrong that is. Dogen's writings are filled with comments on koans. He has his own koan collection of 300 koans. He clearly used koans as a central teaching device with his students. And so I am going to talk about Dogen and his use of koans in the second part of my talk, but I think I want to start with koans themselves. What are koans? This is something you often hear about, but it's widely misunderstood. So I'm going to try in about 10 minutes to make you understand how koans work. All right? And now they're sometimes called Zen riddles. This is not accurate. It's not a riddle. A koan is a short saying attributed to a Zen master of old, usually in the context of a dialogue with an interlocutor, like someone who asks a question. And that saying is believed to encapsulate some kind of Buddhist wisdom, the master's insight, and thus be worthy of holding up for consideration or comment. Now, many sayings used as koans are striking because they use vivid, sometimes irreverent language. So a monk asked Dogen, "What is Buddha?" He said, "A dried piece of shit." Okay, that's a famous koan. Right? When I'm done in 10 minutes, you'll understand it. Or they appear to be non sequiturs. You know, often like the question implies some kind of interest in Buddhist doctrine. It's asking for an explanation, and the answer just seems off the wall. So some scholars, because of those characteristics of koans, describe them as nonsensical statements intended to stop the workings of the intellect, or to sort of cut off discursive or dualistic thinking. And the implication of that totally idiotic interpretation, which is way so wrong, I can't tell you. Like, do you think for 1,000 years people would be interested in this stuff if all it was like some off-the-wall comment which changes the subject? No, that wouldn't happen. But anyway, the implication is that any stupid answer that's irrelevant to the question will serve just as well as any other for a koan. All right? And that's just ridiculous. That's completely ridiculous. So now, the term koan is often translated as public case, but that also is not correct. Ko here means public, but it's a public official, a magistrate or a judge. And in imperial China, the judges or the magistrates in a court had the authority of the emperor. They were appointed by the imperial court, and their word was law. And the an, so that's what a ko is, a magistrate, whose word is law. And an is a bench or a table. So koan means the magistrate's bench. And it's exactly the same sense, like if you go before the bench, you're in court, you're in front of the judge. Okay? That's the root metaphor working here. So a koan, metaphorically, is a case in court. And they're also called old cases. So just like a court of law, the idea is that there are old cases or venerable test cases that set a kind of precedent that later judges should take into account. And so the koans are held up as a kind of model or precedent of Buddhist wisdom, but judges still can judge. And just like with precedent, you take the old case into account, but there's a higher court. A judge can pass judgment on an earlier case. So when koans are held up for comment, they're actually held up for judgment as well. And the comment or judgment is made from a sort of higher perspective on that earlier case. So anyway, according to this metaphor, the Zen master is like a judge. And the disciples, or the people who question him in this metaphor, are like the accused. And in this metaphor, guilt for the accused means ignorance or deluded thinking. And innocence means awakening or freedom from deluded thinking. But the Zen master will decide, because he's the judge, if you are deluded and guilty or if you are awakened and innocent. Okay? And he has that authority. However, you know, having said that, whatever the Zen master says is then subject to further review by another court. So some other Zen master later can comment on that. Now, there were many, many old cases recorded in the Chan and Zen traditions and brought up for commentary. And typically, you know, they're attributed to the ancestral teachers who are famous in the tradition. But once these old cases existed, they were brought up in ritual settings where the abbot in a Zen monastery would get up on a high seat. There'd be a large audience. And people would come forward from the audience and ask the abbot, what about this story? What about that story? What about this koan, that koan? So they could ask the abbot, what about Yunman's dried piece of shit? Because, you know, you probably want to know, what did that mean anyway? And then the abbot would explain, but he would use the same sort of rhetorical style. So the answer to what did Yunmen mean by a dried piece of shit might be something like, he says, come here. So the monk comes forward and the master hits him, something like that, right? So the answer, this is a comment on the old case, but it's not necessarily, and usually is not going to be in a kind of philosophical language. Now also, the masters themselves could raise a case to comment on. So the master could sit up on the high seat, and no one comes forward to the audience. He says, Yunmen's dried piece of shit. And then he comments on that, like that. Also, these old cases could be used in the abbot's private quarters. So disciples would come in and they would, you know, sort of discuss that koan. What does it mean? And have a kind of debate. So sometimes the questioner in the audience in a public setting, a sermon in a Dharma hall, would ask the question, the master would respond, there'd be a follow-up question, he would respond to that, and these discussions of the koan would also get recorded and would end up in the discourse records, or they're called the goroku, or recorded sayings of that particular abbot. So we have for Dogen the Eihei Koroku, which was translated by Dan Layton and Shohaku Okumura. Right? You can hold your book up again for a plug. Okay? These are records, many, many records of Dogen standing up in the Dharma hall, giving sermons, and either someone in the audience raises a koan and he comments on it, or he raises a koan himself and he comments on it. So it's obvious that Dogen used this style of teaching. Now, koans are not nonsensical. This is the point I want to stress. There's a standpoint from which they make sense, and they're perfectly logical. Now, they do involve a lot of wordplay, punning, joking, metaphorical flights of fancy, but all of those are grounded in an understanding of the point being made. You know, it's kind of like if you're getting involved in telling jokes with someone, you have to understand the previous joke to tell the next joke. And if you don't, you're stuck. You don't know what to say. So, you know, this sort of banter looks like it's jumping all around, but there is a thread, and there's a sense that connects it. Now, the meaning of koans, if that's true, then the meaning of any koan can be in logical philosophical language. But that's not the rules of the game. The rules of the rhetorical game of commenting on them call for a response in kind, a quip or a gesture or a quotation from another koan. Now this is very common in Dogen. In Shobo Genzo, he wants to comment on monastic rules, or he wants to comment on the Lotus Sutra, or he wants to comment on a koan. And he'll pull a line from another koan and just say, this is a piece of shit. Just like that. But you have to know, wait a minute, he's quoting Yunmen. You know, and he's saying that my comment on this is like Yunmen's comment when he's asked what is Buddha. And one thing, you know, I'm heavily involved now in translating Dogen Shobo Genzo. A lot of the difficulty in understanding Dogen in the past has been that people did not recognize that what he said were quotes from koans. They didn't know it. When he quoted the Lotus Sutra, everyone knows that because it's very well known in Japanese Buddhism. When he quotes famous koans, people know it. But throughout Shobo Genzo, you find quotes of obscure koans, and the only reason I found them was through digital text search of the Chinese Buddhist canon. And this is an incredible tool that scholars didn't have before. But can you imagine, I made this one up about the piece of shit, but can you imagine if you didn't know that's a quote, and then suddenly he says that, in the middle, it's like, you say, wow, that's really profound. Well, it's not really profound, you just didn't understand at all what's going on. Okay? So, a lot of the sort of Dogen's reputation for being obscure is actually based on that kind of ignorance, right? Ignorance of the text he's citing. And most translations of Dogen, I hate to say it, are filled with places where there's missing quotation marks because the translator didn't know it was a quote. Which is, you know, it's just disaster for the translation. Anyway, we can compare Dogen's use of koans with that of Dahui, who was a very eminent Zen master in the Linji or Rinzai tradition about 60 or 70 years before Dogen went to China. And Dahui seems to espouse the use of a single koan to focus the mind intensively in meditation, build up some kind of great ball of doubt, this is Dahui's language, and then have a single breakthrough awakening experience. And if you can understand one koan, according to this, you can understand all of them. And you only need to like focus the mind intensively, like while sitting in meditation, focus on the koan. And you know, so usually just one word in the koan. So you could focus on piece of shit, because that would be like the key phrase in that koan. And just focus your mind on that, kind of go into trance on that, and then have some kind of breakthrough and understand everything. Now, that style of koan practice, it's usually called Kana-Zen, is very popular in Korea today. People imagine that that's what modern Japanese Rinzai Zen is about. It's not quite true, because they use many, many koans in Rinzai Zen. But this was not, Dogen wasn't talking about using koans as a kind of device in meditation to attain some kind of breakthrough experience. Rather, I think from his point of view, if you familiarize yourself with koans, you read many of them, you study many of them, you practice commenting on them with a teacher, and later the teacher himself becomes the one who comments. But over a long period of time, it's possible to get a different point of view on the world through familiarity with this koan literature.